Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. Welcome to the start of our fall semester seminar series. I'm so glad to be welcoming students back on campus for teaching, and it's a great privilege to also be welcoming an exceptional cohort of associates who are visiting from Japan and other places in the world for the U.S.-Japan Relations Program. I invite you to check out our website for the list of all of our visitors and the upcoming calendar of events. We have a great program ahead this year, thanks to the hard work of our program staff, Shinju Fujihira, Amy Stockton, Emma Duncan, and Sophie Welsh. We only have an hour for our event today, so let me turn now quickly to a brief introduction of our speaker and discussant. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor T.J. Pempel, who is Professor of Political Science at Berkeley University. He is the author and editor of over 20 books, over 40 articles on topics on Japanese politics, political economy, and Asian regionalism. He is also recently retired, but I can say that he is very active, as we can see, because he's already here today to share with us his most recent book that has just come out, A Region of Regimes, Prosperity and Plunder in the Asia Pacific by Cornell University Press. TJ has long been a friend of the program on U.S.-Japan Relations. He was our distinguished visitor in 2010. He also, beyond writing so many books that have shaped the discipline of political economy and Japanese politics, is a competitive long-distance runner. Over 40 years, he completed 30 marathons, multiple times, the Boston Marathon. And so I'm just incredibly impressed at productivity on all dimensions. We're also delighted to have as our discussant Harvard Business School professor Meg Rithmire. She is the professor of business administration at Harvard Business School, also holds a political science PhD from Harvard University. Meg is co-directing the Weatherhood Center Regions Cluster and is a leading scholar of Chinese capitalism with an important book on the politics of property rights in China. And she has examined China as a source of new regionalism with an article in World Politics. Today's seminar is part of our special series on Japanese economic statecraft. The event is also co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs Research Cluster on Regions in a Multipolar World, and is also co-sponsored by the Harvard University Asia Center. Now I'd like to introduce our next seminar, and you can see we're going to be discussing the digital transformation in Japan's business reinvention with Orike Shada of UCSD as our featured speaker. And now let me remind you of our Zoom etiquette. We're going to ask that you have yourself on muted microphone during the presentations. You may write a question in the chat, and if you use the raise hand button, I will try to call on you. If time allows, we'll ask you to present your own question. If we're running short on time, I may collect some of the questions to share with our speakers. Please do respect privacy and have gallery view, do not record. We will have an authorized video that we put up ourselves. Now let's begin. I'd like to turn over to Professor Pempel.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thanks to Meg, to Shin, and to Meg for participating in this. Thanks to everybody else for joining this session. It's always a pleasure to be back at Harvard, even remotely, and I've had many long associations there that I certainly appreciate. Let me just start by turning on my timer so that I don't screw this up. Basically, this book starts with three motivations that grow out of my longstanding work. The first of these is an effort to try and understand the sources and the meaning and the import of Asia's economic growth. The second really comes out of my concern to try and understand broad patterns of comparative political economy, how and why different countries pursue radically different categories of political economy. And my third set of concerns with the book is to try to understand the Asian region as a whole, the changing dynamics within that region, and the ways in which the region has been shaped and reshaped by economic forces, by domestic political economies, and the like. And in order to do this, I really challenge some of the notions about regional economic growth in the book. The first big challenge, I guess, is that the book finds no single path for Asian economic development. The political economies of East Asia, in the way I look at it, are in some respects quite different, but at the same time fit into certain rather similar patterns, ideal types, if you want, that bear enough similarity to one another to allow them to be categorized together. At the same time, it's also important, and I try to do this in the book, to show that not all Asian countries grew. Some of the political economies were set up in ways that dramatically resisted economic growth for political reasons that I'll get into in a minute. And the third big point about regional growth is that these were not essentially domestic or national stories exclusively, but it's really critical to understand the ways in which international forces played a key role in shaping the continuity of political economy within the national governments. And so it's that interface between domestic and international politics that I think is also critical to understanding how things evolved over time. So what are the key patterns that I find over periods of time? And here, the book takes really a 30,000-foot view of 10 countries over about 40-year period. And that 30,000-foot view that I have in the book gets expanded or lifted up to more of a Jeff Bezos Blue Origins view. So I hope you'll appreciate the fact that I'm going to give you a very schematic presentation of the book, but I hope that some of the interior material is of sufficient nuance so that you might find other bits and pieces in there beyond those big patterns. The key trait that I look at in terms of understanding domestic political economies is what I call regimes. And there are three big pieces to this, and they connect in what Max Weber calls elective affinities. That is to say, I'm less concerned with which one comes first, which one causes the other, which ones are dependent and independent variables, and I'm much more interested in the complex or the synchronicity among these three forces. The first of these are political institutions. These are essentially the state, but also not only state bureaucratic agencies, but also central local relations. Political parties were salient, but basically it's political institutions. The second big force, socioeconomics. What are the key social groups, the key economic groups that play a role in shaping the political economy? And to what extent do they align with one another? How are they in contest with one another? The third big force, external components. And here I just want to make two big points. One, external forces may be supportive of the domestic power structure and favorable to economic growth, or supportive of a domestic forces of regime that are opposed to growth. So you get a situation in which external forces can play either a positive or negative role in sustaining the domestic forces, but they also can play a big role in shaping the nature of the economic policy paradigm that any regime pursues. And so the last piece of the story from a theoretical perspective is that I see each type of regime associated with a particular type of economic policy paradigm. That is to say, particular regimes pursue specific economic policy paradigms over sustained periods. And so in that effort to try and provide a picture of what is going on among these, the three darker shaded areas are regime components that reinforce each other, that play together with one another, and the economic policy paradigm tends to provide a reinforcing mechanism that re-enhances support for, reinforces the regime coherence and holds it together. With that in mind, just a quick point on the structure of the book. It's really divided into two parts. The first of these is rather static. It looks at ideal types, really identifying 3 types of regimes that I see as prevalent over the course of these 40 years. And they advance different economic paradigms. I identify 3 different types of regimes. One I call developmental regimes, the second ersatz developmental regimes, pseudo-developmental regimes, and the third are what I call rapacious regimes. And the second part of the book really tries to move beyond the stasis of that first part and to look at some of the dynamics that are involved. So one chapter looks at the restructuring of regimes. How do regimes move over time away from the ancien regime, away from the old patterns due to changing forces, and how do they move in a new direction and reconstitute themselves? The second of those chapters in the second part of the book focuses on China, which I see as a hybrid regime, putting together traits of all 3 of these first groups. And then finally, I try to look at what Ken Waltz would call the second image, namely the ways in which the combination of regimes at any particular time in the region as a whole shape the regional order, and how those regional orders have changed over time as a consequence of changes in the mix of regimes that prevail across the Asia Pacific. All of that by way of background. To get into more specific details, the developmental regime characteristics, prototypes are ones that you're probably very familiar with: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, long studied as developmental states. I see the state in ways that Chalmers-Johnson does, et cetera. Many of us have looked at this for a long period of time, but cohesive, skilled, talented bureaucrats capable of exercising a singular direction to economic policy. Socioeconomics, key forces in the country, very pro-growth. They reflect what Dan Slater called a protectionist pact, an effort to hold together certain social forces, socioeconomic forces, that fear for their own survival if communism were to take over or if socialism were to take over domestically. So they come together in a way to try and protect their own self-interest through rapid economic growth. And meanwhile, opposition forces are terribly fragmented. And finally, the third piece, international forces, supportive of the domestic power structure, supportive of the anti-communism, supportive of high growth, and strongly opposed to any socialist forces or domestic forces that might challenge the pattern of regime dominance. The corresponding policy paradigm that I see here is one I've called embedded mercantilism. It has a number of traits: a focus on rapid economic growth, rapid movement up the technological gradient, a continual focus on industrial upgrading. These regimes are largely closed to incoming foreign direct investment, incoming manufacturing products that might compete with domestic efforts at industrial development. And there's a continual upscaling of workers' skills. Workers are trained both by the government and by businesses to improve their skills, which makes it possible for corporations continually to move up the technological gradient because they have the skilled workforces to be competitive, increasingly competitive in the international marketplace. And importantly for me, and much less studied, I think, the benefits of rapid growth are sustained largely by domestic actors. It's domestic capitalists, it's domestic workers that are the primary beneficiaries of the rapid economic growth, which results in high levels of social equality across these countries in ways that make them look socioeconomically very much like many of the social democracies of Northern Europe. The second pattern is what I call ersatz developmental regimes, prototypes Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, very different in terms of their state institutions from the developmental regimes in that they're far more fragmented, they're far more divided by ethnicity, by patronage. Their skill levels in their bureaucracies, in their government institutions, generally are at a much lower level. The social forces, similarly, very fragmented, ethnic tensions, central local tensions, strong regionalism, and importantly for the economic development, they have very strong agricultural sectors, that are politically powerful, and they also rely much more heavily on natural resources than do the developmental regimes, all of which are essentially lacking in those resources. And finally, you have no cohesive growth or anti-growth coalition, so it's a back and forth. And in terms of external support, this comes in the form largely of foreign direct investment, multinational corporations that take advantage of these countries to try to plug into their labor markets in ways that make the policy paradigm one that reflects the same high levels of growth and export dependence that the developmental regimes enjoy, but conversely are heavily dependent on low-skilled jobs, no incentives for improving the workforce capabilities, talents, skills. So you have largely packaging, low-level technical components being manufactured, the result of which is that the bulk of the profits from growth move overseas, and very few of them redound in large proportions to domestic actors. The end consequence of which is that all of these countries risk being stuck in what many have called the middle income trap. That is to say, they grow and they improve per capita GDP up to a point, but that point is stuck at sort of $3,500 or $4,000 per capita, with very great difficulty in moving beyond that because the skills are not there, the corporate structure is not there, the political incentives are not there to move ahead and move up the technological gradient. Finally, what I call rapacious regimes, the prototypes North Korea, Myanmar, the Philippines, particularly under Marcos. State institutions are essentially structured for repression of the citizenry, a very narrow political and ruling elite in charge. Socioeconomically, no viable opposition, of course, particularly at the center, but importantly, Myanmar and the Philippines have strong opposition to the central government. In Myanmar, in the regions outside the ethnically dominated Sha, Rohingya, Mu, etc., areas under local control that challenge militarily the military regime at the center in Bangkok. I'm sorry, in I'm losing it. The capital. I'll pass on this because I've got 20 minutes. I'm not going to spend 10 of them trying to remember the capital, Rangoon, sorry. And very few independent social groups. And lastly, international forces combine either to provide strong sanctions against high economic growth, or in the case of Myanmar and in the case of the Philippines, forces that sustain anti-growth forces, the US sugar manufacturers linked to Philippine sugar industry that work to sustain the power of rural elites and that work against industrialization. And meanwhile, efforts in places like Myanmar or North Korea by China to extract natural resources, but very few of these redound to the success of the economy, so that you have slow to no growth, massive defense spending, heavy reliance on raw materials and agricultural exports, but limited capability for enhancing manufacturing and moving up that technological gradient. And as a result, very few benefits to the general citizenry. So those are the three patterns that I see playing across the region over these 40 years. But then I think we also have, in the second part of the book, some interesting changes that take place, some interesting dynamics that I want to explore. So the first of these takes a look at Japan, Korea, and Taiwan as the developmental regimes that find themselves losing some of the political support, the global support that they once had. The domestic conditions change, often due to economic success. So these countries face what I, in an earlier iteration, called the dilemmas of success. The protectionist pacts no longer hold together because communism fades as a threat. The fears of revolution coming domestically are eradicated by the growth of middle classes. But you also have a big change in the incentive to core elements of the regime, so that the internal regime begins to fragment a bit. Some forces that once supported the ASEAN regime begin looking for new patterns particularly new patterns of economic policy. But these regimes do not disappear. Core elements of the regime continue, but they face much stronger opposition that now has enhanced resources, and you have greater political and policy pluralism, debates over policy, no longer quite so committed to rapid growth at all costs, protection at all costs. The embedded mercantilist policy becomes much more difficult to sustain. And the last point I want to make about this is all three countries do not move at the same pace. So they adjust in very different ways. Korea much quicker to embrace neoliberalism than, say, Japan is. Taiwan and South Korea much quicker to embrace foreign direct investment, whereas Japan remains much slower to embrace that foreign direct investment. The fifth chapter takes a look at China, and I see this as a hybrid of the other three traits. It's similar to the developmental regimes in terms of its cohesive party state at the center. It is a regime that is capable of making and sustaining policy directions. Rather talented officials that become more talented over time after the Deng Xiaoping reforms begin. There's a very strong export orientation like the developmental regimes. And there's also a heavy favoring of domestic firms, which I think we see re-accelerating now in the increased focus on state-owned enterprises and the efforts to provide a certain decoupling from the US-China economic interactions. But they're also like the ersatz developmental regimes insofar as they were very heavily dependent on foreign direct investment, on technological sharing, on foreign advisors coming in, and much more penetration of the domestic market by whether it's Apple or Starbucks or Buick or whatever, than was ever the case with the developmental regimes, much more like the ersatz regimes, and also, at least in the early phases of the economic development, much more dependent on low-level, low-skilled jobs. But China, unlike the ersatz regimes, more like the developmental regimes, has built in new skills, has moved up its technological skills for its workforce, and now is better able to escape that middle income trap than the ersatz regimes. And finally, it's like the rapacious regimes insofar as that narrow political elite has a very strong capacity for police control, military control, citizen repression. There's also a very strong element of top Communist Party leadership extracting disproportionate benefits for themselves. At the same time, the benefits, generally speaking, have been widely distributed to the society as a whole. So China has escaped the worst aspects of rapaciousness in terms of being able to enjoy rapid economic growth, but has done so at the cost of citizen freedom and pluralism. Finally, the last point that I want to make concerns the regional orders in the regime. And here, I basically see the Asia-Pacific, East Asia going through three very different orders. The first of these, the Cold War, where economic and security patterns overlapped heavily. Communist countries traded only with communist countries. Democracies, or America's allies, traded only with one another. Very little cross-cutting between economics and security. But ultimately, it was the American-based models of economic growth that began to penetrate throughout the region, and it gave the greatest shape to the region. And we see this with China embracing the kinds of capitalist model that was pursued by Japan, Korea, Taiwan. We see the Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand economies benefiting from the foreign direct investment moving out from Japan and Korea and Taiwan. And we then have this period of what I would call peace and prosperity, where basically from the 1980s to the 2000s, diplomatic relationships that had once been sour become improved. Many bilateral patterns, Japan, Korea, for example, Malaysia, Indonesia, for example, improve rapidly. China is not perceived as a threat. The rapacious regimes have very little impact on the region as a whole, unable to challenge its security. But we're now facing a situation in which the United States is moving away from the region. China is becoming more assertive. Its leadership is becoming more demanding militarily, the consequence of which is that we're now facing that classic dilemma between agency and structure. Are the structures such that we're moving into a decline in power by the United States, a rise in power by China, and the classic security dilemma that that creates? Or is there enough political agency left in the region so that many of these regimes will do their best to retain the peace and prosperity that prevailed over the region for the preceding 30-ish years or so? So with that, I'll move down from blue origins and get down to the ground and turn it over to Meg Rithmire for her comments and suggestions. Thanks very much.
Great. So thank you both to Christina Davis and to Professor Pempel for sharing, for inviting me to do this and for sharing the book and proofs for me to read. It's out, I think, now for everyone, but I felt the slight amount of privilege in getting to read it in an earlier form. I should also say I appreciate Professor Pempel for kind of a lifetime of education. I remember reading his work right after the Asian financial crisis as an undergraduate student of Rick Donors, who told me at the time, you can go to graduate school and you can be a China scholar and you can still do comparison. And Pempel's new book indeed shows the value of this classic form of comparative politics and of political economy, really this version of political economy that's relating political organization and political imperatives to economic outcomes. So as you heard in the last few minutes, the book is really an extraordinary achievement in synthesis and in regional knowledge. There are 10 real cases in the book. The book is nonetheless judicious about including enough information to learn quite a bit about each of the cases and what actually happened in each country, but not so much that one loses the thread of comparison. So Pempel asks of each case two main questions in my view. First, what are the political arrangements and imperatives that underlie economic policy choices? And second, how do external and regional forces as well as domestic socioeconomic issues figure into these choices? The second question in my mind is really key, because we've known for almost a generation now, and partly from Pempel's own body of work, what kind of institutions seem like the right ones for generating economic development. And so the book really is more about explaining the economic policy paradigms themselves than it is about explaining growth outcomes. So let me just focus on two of the contributions that seemed to me really novel about the new book. So the first is the idea of thinking about economic policy in terms of regimes. And by regimes, TJ means the quote, fused interactions of three components pivotal to a country's political economy. As you just heard, those are state institutions, socioeconomic forces, and the external forces. And these share, as you heard him just say, elective affinities. So what's innovative here is the idea of a regime, right? It goes beyond just policy or institutions. So we're used to this institutional political economy saying, we just look at these policies and institutions. Do you get the macro right? Do you get some of the institutions right? But this is kind of the whole of social and political interactions, domestic and external. And the idea of regime kind of sees how these things are self-reinforcing. So those of us who work a lot in political economy are very familiar with the idea of feedback loops or positive reinforcement that come with varieties of capitalism and these different kinds of models. But this book also shows us how the forces interact, not just to create policy and institutional choices, but also these norms and expectations and even cultures of economic behavior, which do change over time, but are quite sticky in the medium term. And we see how these regimes kind of emerge in different countries. The other thing to me that's valuable about the idea of a regime is that it's time sensitive. So these regimes, they don't last forever. And as you just heard Professor Pempel talk about how developmental states or this embedded mercantilism changes over time as a result of both exogenous and endogenous forces. And so we get to see this kind of reconstruction of different regimes, at least with the developmental states that he talks about in the very beginning of the book. So in addition to this idea of the regime concept in political economy, let me say a couple of other things about the book's real achievements. So the first, and I think Professor Davis partly asked me to be the discussant here because I'm part of a new group of people looking at regions in the world. And you have to look at the title of this book and remember a little bit, this is a region of regimes, and we think of Peter Katzenstein's A World of Regions, right? But to look at national economic development trajectories in regional and in global terms. And so one particular substantive insight was really striking to me, which was that the Cold War was externalized in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, and in a way that more or less enabled a kind of domestic mobilization and a friendly Western orientation to those countries. But in other places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and even some of the rapacious regimes, it was internalized, which helped political elites like the Barisan Nasional or Suharto consolidate power vis-a-vis domestic enemies. But it also meant that it kind of fractured these socioeconomic coalitions and made the international environment less propitious for domestic economic development. The second is the role of globalization and global capital. And here, let me say, if there were an antagonist in this book, on my reading, it's global financial capital. I'm not sure if I'm getting that right, but it certainly seemed to me that both this opening to global capital in the part of some of the regimes made them, as you heard the professor just say, the kind of benefits of economic development accrued to outsiders rather than insiders. And when you get the dissolution of the embedded mercantilism and the change of the developmental states, it's also because of the opening to foreign direct investment, both outward and inward. And so I'd love to hear further thoughts on that, because it really does seem like global financial capital is quite the enemy of widely shared and equal domestic economic development in most of these countries. And lastly, substantively and methodologically, let me say, the effort to bring in two Asian countries, which are normally excluded from comparisons in the region, and that's the DPRK and in China. And I think the inclusion of both should really be applauded. So any effort to understand the political logic of the DPRK is a good effort. And we do get a really compelling narrative that the regime, kind of despite its ideological and revolutionary foundations, is really comparable to a case of economic plunder, and critically, that it's kind of organized to do so. So we're used to thinking of communism or state socialism as sort of accidentally falling into a failed development program. But what we see really from the evidence in this book is that the Kims organized the institutions of the state and the DPRK in order to basically plunder from society and from the DPRK. And that was really quite a revelation to me. And he includes China, which I'll say more about in just a few minutes. It's a hard to categorize thing, and it maybe itself represents multiple regimes over time and space, as well as just being a hybrid of the different forms that the book lays out. So in just a couple more minutes, let me say a few words of critical reflection, if I may. So first, for a region, Asia, that began the period under study as profoundly agrarian, right, dominated by peasants, dominated by agricultural sectors, the issue of rural development seems to figure very little into this story. So of course, we're interested in industrialization, and that tends to be a kind of urban phenomenon, but of course it requires, as generations of political economy tell us, that surplus labor in the countryside be mobilized in some way. So the part of the rural story that we do get is land reform, right? In the successful countries in particular, they destroyed the landed gentry, and as a result, they were able to mobilize the surplus labor. But there are two observations in particular I think are worth stating. So first, I'd like to point everyone's attention to a terrific new book by Kristen Looney, Mobilizing for Rural Development, on rural mobilization campaigns in developmental states. So she looks at Korea, Taiwan, as well as China and kind of Japan. So at these surprising politics behind rural transformation and what we thought of as technocratic states. And so I think the story is really still being written on this issue. It's not just an issue of industrialization or of technocratic politics, but really of human-led mobilization in those regimes, which can be quite surprising to those of us who are quite used to the developmental state. And second, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, they have this special legacy of plantation agriculture, which has actually accelerated in recent years and tends to arrest the kind of economic achievements that those countries can have, even though they're all the while contributing to these exports. And so this attention to how the rural sector is organized, I think, was lacking just a little bit in the book. Second, I was curious, including China, of course, is excellent, but I think we should get something out of analyzing it, even if we conclude, which I completely agree, that its state institutions, its socioeconomic dynamics, and its external environment are sort of sui generis. And what I glean from the conclusion is that China is basically an illustration that centralized power and a strong state are necessary for economic development, but also that perhaps it was state control over the financial sector, which allowed China to kind of grow without crisis, which seems quite provocative, actually, if we want state control over the financial sector in a country like China. And lastly, let me just say that the richest material on the regional aspects of Asia's transformation come at the end of the book. And so, of course, I think there's good reason to do this because the end of the book, TJ's looking at this future of what he calls competitive geopolitics, in which a US-China rivalry and new articulations of national security are playing greater roles in Asia's future than they did in its recent past. And so, of course, you can't start the book with the future, so it makes sense to leave it for the end. But I ended up reading most of the book wondering sort of what does he mean by regional orders, and only realizing the kind of brilliance of it at the very end. And although I applaud, the regional focus, and I think there's so much here to run with, I would quibble just a little bit that some of the regional orders that he described seem to me more global orders, and even really orders about US-China relations. And so there are other kinds of regional forces or things that we might think of that create the region that's Asia, such as racial conflicts over Chinese capital owners, which I expect to actually increase in the future, or the hyper embrace of sovereign equality across countries in ASEAN in particular, and non-intervention in domestic affairs that are also part of the regional order, which feature in sort of as either national issues or perhaps not at all. And so let me just say in conclusion that this is the kind of book that I think almost any graduate student in comparative political economy should read. It's a synthetic work. Obviously, the production of someone who's worked for the last several decades on intimately understanding all of these economies in Asia. I learned a ton from it, and I'd like to fancy myself already an expert on the region. And so this opportunity to read the book in depth and think about it, I'm really grateful for. So thank you. Looking forward to hearing some questions.
Thank you both so very much. I will second Meg's comment that everyone should read this book, not only graduate students. In fact, I'll be teaching a course on trade and development in East Asia this spring for undergraduates, and already plan to update the syllabus and add this book as a key assignment. It's really comprehensive in explaining how political institutions and underlying economic structures interact with international relations to shape key outcomes. And I am so grateful to TJ for sharing the book with us, and Meg for her incredible comments. She's highlighted the questions of, is global finance the adversary? Is there a more complex role for land reform? And how should we think about the region as having its own inner dynamic? And I would like to add my own question about, how did Japan's capital and lesson uniquely shape these other countries? And so if you were to think of the role of Japanese foreign aid and the exchanges of staff and students, is there a region that we should think of as having come from the Japanese example, proactively cultivated by Japan? And maybe instead of global finance as the adversary, what was the role of Japanese finance? But we also have many questions. We have 20 minutes for discussion, and I'd like to lead off by turning to one of our associates. And after he has asked his question, I'll let you give a few brief remarks, TJ, and then open to the floor for anyone else who's raised their hand in the participant bar. So let me first turn to our associate with the program on US-Japan relations, Mr. Koichi Ai, who is serving as the head of chancery at the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. after a 30-year career in the foreign ministry that has included postings in Paris as the deputy permanent representative of Japan to the OECD. Mr. Ai, I welcome your question.
Thank you, Professor Davis, and thank you very much, Professor Pempel, for very enlightening discussion on the very important topic. I particularly like the idea of a regime having a third element of external forces. As a practitioner, I think we are faced with this aspect of relations all the time. Of course, I understand this external forces and regime to be interactive elements. Works both ways, I understand. That external forces shape regime, and regime, on the other hand, by virtue of mixing with others, works on the external environment. So given that, my question is, would it be possible to extrapolate the implications of your findings in the book on the regional strategic environment in, let's say, next 30 years? What would be the impact of the development you described toward the future. That would be something that I'm very much interested in. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, TJ, if you'd like to take a few minutes to answer some of the questions, if not all, from Meg, myself, and Mr. I.
Sure. Particular thanks to Meg for such a careful reading of the book. You pulled out some things that I suspect I didn't even know were in there. So that's always very nice. Much less nice is finding out that you were reading my stuff when you were an undergraduate, but at least you were out of primary school. So I'm feeling a little less old than I might otherwise have done with your comments. I think the comments on land reform, on the importance of agricultural development are really critical. This in many ways is a sub-theme of parts of the book. I certainly think the developmental regimes were critically influenced by the fact that they all did go through land reform. They did manage to eliminate the force of powerful landlords that had dominated these places, these countries in the pre-World War II era. So I think that's very critical. And the flip side is the fact that the Philippines has never gone through that kind of land reform, I think makes it very amenable to understanding as that much more rapacious for the agricultural sector and for landed elites. But clearly, I have to defer to you on this. It's, what's the usual cliche? More research needs to be done in this subject. Whether I'm going to be the one to do it or not, I guess not. But I think you picked up some really critical elements of this. Whether China should be seen as a hybrid regime or a sui generis regime. One of the temptations, it's always tough to talk about how one might have done a book differently, but one of the earlier temptations I had was to look at Vietnam and China in comparison. But to be perfectly honest, the Vietnam case got to be very, very complicated. I felt I knew China a little bit better, and one could very easily have created a fourth category, perhaps I'm not quite sure what you would want to call it, but the party state regime. But regardless, I think you're right that China does provide this interesting additional case. And in terms of the other point that you made about the importance of the regional order being perhaps more understandable as distinct from or as an added element to the global order, certainly the Cold War, and possibly even that whole period of peace and prosperity, and certainly the rising tensions look to be much more global perhaps than they are regional. I think your suggestions about tensions between sovereignty and sovereignty infringement or sovereignty surrender are things that I'm now trying to work on. It does seem to me that much of the multilateralism in East Asia has been in resistance to any surrender of sovereignty, in contrast to Western Europe, for example, where countries are prepared to surrender elements of their sovereignty in the pursuit of a broader global or common agenda, whether it's global climate change or deciding the number of tires that a tractor can have as it crosses borders between the Belgian and the Netherlands. In terms of Mr. I's question about project the next 30 years, that's always a very safe bet. I was told very early in political science that you should always make predictions at least 10 years out, because if you're right, you can always go back and say, see, I told you. And if you're wrong, nobody will remember because it's not that much in their minds. And certainly 30 years is a longer bet. I'm going to, though, go back to a point that I made very briefly in my comments. And it's really a genuflection to diplomats like yourself. And that is to say, I think really the future is going to be heavily, there are structural elements that are obviously going to affect things. I mean, China is a rising power. China is a rising economic power, as well as a military power. Japan has a powerful role to play, an important role to play if it can improve its domestic economic resources. Korea has at least a small and not insignificant role to play in terms of dealing with North Korea and in terms of dealing with economic growth across the region, et cetera. So I think there are these structural forces there, but I do think that we're now at one of those pivotal points where agency by political actors has the capacity to play a very powerful role in shaping the future. I'm way outside the purview of my book, but quite clearly, I think for the United States, any competition with China has to be very cognizant of the fact that there are some issues over which the two are going to have very contentious relationships and see the world very differently. But there are many areas where there's the opportunity for cooperation. And there are some where it's simply going to be competitive. My company versus your company, 5G, et cetera. And differentiating those three categories, I think, becomes very important in the future. And I would like to see much less of a complete decoupling between China and the United States, which I think lays the groundwork for the possible security tensions between the two, and try to see much more of a search for areas where there's overlap and cooperation. But I think in this context as well, Japan has a possibly positive role to play because of its deep economic links to China and across the region. And this fits into Christina's question about the importance of Japanese foreign aid, Japanese foreign direct investment in Southeast Asia, Japanese investment in Taiwan. Japan still has a very positive and powerful role that it could potentially play in trying to soften some of the security tensions. I understand why Japan has joined the Quad and how this has the capacity to be seen as really a challenge to China. But I think if the Quad is to go forward, it needs to be very carefully understood as simply a security mechanism that does not countervail the economic interactions and does not mean a complete decoupling, a complete return to Cold War 2.0. And I think countries like Japan, countries like Korea, and even Taiwan in its own venue, and ASEAN as a whole, have the capacity to provide some diplomatic efforts to try to soften tensions, reduce the areas of great conflict, and in many cases to cooperate with the United States in terms of providing common challenges to some of the worst effects of Chinese assertiveness and pushing collectively to try to enhance or to reduce some of the tensions within China that are built up against against foreign manufacturers, against foreign companies, and to provide for a common challenge to some of the WTO exceptions or violations that China is clearly carrying out. So I think there's a collective role to be played in terms of putting pressure on China. I think if all of the ducks line up in a very positive way, we have the capacity to see East Asia be a somewhat contested region going forward, but one in which the worst threats of kinetic conflict, to use the Defense Department's term, are reduced. And I think, I would hope that a country like Japan can cooperate with the United States where those things are possible, and also work to soften some of the tensions with places like China or even North Korea, where the tensions are likely to be greater. So I've talked longer than I should. I should allow Christina to get to the questions.
Very interesting. We now have a question from one of our new associates, Catherine Starr, who's been working at NHK World News. And go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, thank you both very much for being here. As Christina mentioned, I am a journalist with NHK, and I did a lot of reporting on ASEAN, and you mentioned it briefly, and that was actually my question I was curious about. How do you see the role that this economic union plays in the regional order? You mentioned the Quad as possibly softening security tensions, but I am curious if you see ASEAN as being an impactful alliance for the region and beyond.
Poor ASEAN. Its advocates point to a number of positive things that it's done, whether, you're talking about Amitabh Acharya and people like him talking about the ways in which ASEAN's intervention really helped soften Vietnam's approach to the region, helped soften Myanmar's military dictatorship and led to moves to greater democratization and the like. But then there are also its detractors that essentially say, basically a talk shop. The best comment I think I heard about ASEAN was from someone I know who was a very avid participant in ASEAN for one of the Southeast Asian governments. And he said, look, he said, one of the great things about ASEAN is that essentially all of the senior diplomats and foreign policy and economic experts across the 10 ASEAN countries are either preparing for an ASEAN meeting, at an ASEAN meeting, or writing up a report from an ASEAN meeting. He said, maybe that means that we're a talking shop, but he said, when diplomats are spending that much time preparing for meetings, reporting for meetings and the like, they don't have any time to think about how to get into conflicts with each other. So we've at least kept the peace within the region. I think it's a very tough model to export to Northeast Asia. The Southeast Asian countries have had much less difficulty eliminating some of their internal tensions, the Indonesia-Malaysia tension, for example, tensions on the Thai border with Malaysia. Those can be dealt with, and they have been dealt with. And but we also saw that ASEAN was very useless with regard to the Rohingya ethnic cleansing by the military regime. They've not been very effective in dealing with the resurgence of militarism within Myanmar, et cetera. So I think its force is limited, but on the other hand, I think it's better to have that cooperation among those 10 than it would be if they were at each other's throats. So that's kind of a limp answer, but I think it's not insignificant in the role that it plays. The difficulty is going to be providing a convincing alternative that encourages countries like China or Japan or Korea to say, look, we've got some problems among ourselves. Maybe if we weave ASEAN into the mix and make this something more than just a bilateral set of tensions and make it a regional issue, maybe the expansion of that issue will allow for greater cooperation, and maybe some of these ASEAN countries will have suggestions or will be able to provide mechanisms that will help us soften the bilateral or trilateral tensions that now divide us from one another.
Next, I'd like to call on Professor Kaoru Iokibe of the University of Tokyo, who's here as a visiting scholar with the program on US-Japan relations.
Thank you for Professor Pempel for your stimulating talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. I'm interested in whether economic orientation matters to your regime classification. Economic orientation, I mean, whether it is export oriented or domestic consumption oriented. The pro-Japan is, I think, basically export-oriented economy, and the government, I think, and the are fairly developing well. But in the meantime, because Japan needs to expand export, Japan has to repress price, therefore repress wage and repress labor movement. There's a huge inequality. So it is virtually Latin America on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean. In the post-war era, I think Japan is a domestic consumption-oriented economy, and there's a high level of equality, as you mentioned too. And can you put both of them into the category of developmental regime or pro-Japan somehow as a developmental regime? This is my question, and I think this question is important because of the depopulation in Japan today. Japan is now getting more exported oriented, so it matters Japan and it also matters the type of. Thank you.
I have to apologize. Your voice was breaking up on parts of this, but let me see if I understood the question correctly. And it's this tension between domestic focus and export orientation. And I do think that one of the difficulties that the developmental regimes made and are still dealing with is the fact that they have to move, that ultimately they have achieved sufficient export orientation that they have to then move toward greater domestic consumer orientation. And that involves a shift in things like interest rates. It involves a greater openness in terms of regulation to foreign direct investment, to mergers and acquisitions, but to put a very sharp point on this, the export-oriented economies of the developmental states really were of benefit to the producers and not to the consumers. And now the shift has to be toward greater reliance on the consumers, even if that comes periodically at the expense of profits to the corporations. And it means also a shift from manufacturing goods that will be sold overseas to provision of goods and services that will be oriented more toward the domestic audience. And whether this means design, whether it means greater consumer product orientation, et cetera, it does mean a shift that I think really is, it's not as though you give up the exports in favor of the imports or consumers, but it has to be a greater balance and a greater mix. And I think so far, Korea has begun to make that transition better than Japan. So I hope that's really an answer to your question. But as I said, I had a little difficulty with the voice breaking up periodically. So let me just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you for a great answer. And sorry about my voice. I'm looking forward to have discussion with you in person in the future.
We have time for one or two more questions. We have an incredible audience here. Ulrike, would you like to lead off with a question then?
Yeah, thank you. On this last point, TJ, so thank you, first of all, great book and wonderful. On this last point, this consumer, I've always wondered how we actually think about the consumer, because people in states have different roles, right? So they are households, they are families, they are and consumers as families, they're employees at the same time. And clearly the big winner in the developmental state model, one of the big winners was the person as an employee, because of this big emphasis on lifetime employment. The person as a consumer got a little bit less well off because there was actually limited choice, but what choice there was fine and quality checked, right? The person, the household as a saver got totally milked, right? Because there were no returns on savings really, because interest rates were, at least in Japan in the 60s and 70s, interest rates were kept at an artificially low level to keep the cost of borrowing low for the companies. So as savers, household lost, but as people, I don't think they got the short end of the stick, because they had this very stable setting where there was a commitment by companies to provide welfare, not everybody, but a large portion. I mean, so 75% of the workforce, that's a large portion. So the question, there's a question here at the end of this, which is, to what extent do we want to think about a new balance of winners and losers, where in fact, when this breaks open, people lose, not as consumers, but as workers? And then my second question to you is, as you reflect on writing this book, to what extent did you anchor that actually on the Japan model? I mean, so how is the Japan model questioned by this comparison? So what is it that the others have done differently that Japan could learn? Thanks.
Okay. As always, an awful lot of material there. I would point out, much as we like the Japanese employment model in the 60s and 70s, it's important to point out that two groups, I think, were systematically disadvantaged. First of all, is women, who are almost always at the margins of the employment pattern. Now, that didn't hurt quite as badly as it did in many countries, because for the most part, Japanese women got married early, stayed married, regardless of what their husbands were like or how much they did or didn't like them. But for a whole variety of reasons, divorce rates in Japan were quite low, as a consequence of which the family unit tended to benefit from the overall employment model. But women had a very subjugated role within that. And secondly, the other group that was somewhat disadvantaged, and one that I think really needs to be given much greater leverage today in Japan, is younger people. You did fine as a younger person if you got on the employment escalator at 25 and allowed the escalator to carry you up to 55 or so. But by God, you could never, go up the down escalator and run into a garage and create a new company that was going to do something dynamic and that would challenge the existing structure. Your success depended on your acceptance of the overall employment model. So you didn't ask about this, but I'll tell you my suggestions for Japan now, if there is to be economic revitalization, two of the forces that really need to be given greater flexibility, greater power are both women and younger people. And somehow Japan has to make a decision about how to empower those two so that the younger startup-oriented individual, the startup cluster of people can provide a focus on those consumer goods, for example, or provide new services that have not previously been offered by the larger companies. And I think bringing in women clearly means taking much better advantage of the 50% of the population who've been systematically marginalized. And this becomes particularly critical given the large number of retirees in Japan and the fact that you're now moving to a dependence on healthcare benefits and retirement benefits. Now, to the question that really is at the heart of this, am I really a Japan specialist pretending to be a regional specialist? And I guess I have to plead guilty to that in some respects. I mean, in many ways, my thinking about many of these issues were predicated on what I think was my longer standing understanding of Japan. And I did go through an intellectual transformation where I began to look at the Japanese model being picked up by South Korea, by Taiwan. But then I became very clear in my mind that when Japan moved overseas, it was through largely its investment, its foreign direct investment into Southeast Asia, which really didn't replicate the Japanese model. So yes, indeed, the Japanese model, I think, has been in the back of my mind in many respects for very sustained periods of time. And I am probably playing off all of my thinking in some ways with that Japan model in the back of my mind. I'd like to think I've also been very cognizant in my work on Japan to try and see where it is similar to and where it is different from other countries. And so some of the earlier work I did on one-party dominant democracies or on Japan vis-a-vis Italy and France and Germany and so forth has informed some of my thinking about these other cases. But clearly, I've been involved with Japan for more than 50 years. And, Bob Whiting has a new book out in which he talks about being a 19-year-old who went to Japan in 1961, I believe it was. I got there only 2 years later and have been involved with Japan ever since. And so, that's impossible to shake from my mind. The same way it's impossible for me to shake New York ethnicity from my mind because I grew up in an ethnic politics where you stood on the west side of Manhattan played a big role in how you voted in a whole variety of issues. So yeah, guilty as charged.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us all. I think that at the program, we share your view that there's much we can learn from a focus on Japan as well as comparison to other countries' experiences. We've been fortunate to hear about your book today. We could discuss much longer, but our time is at an end. And fortunately, we can read the full book to get more of your insights. And we're also fortunate that we'll get to hear from Professor Ulrike Schade next week when she presents on her own work. And I'd like to thank you all for participating, especially our discussant, Meg Rithmire. Excellent comments that really helped to launch our discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.